Well, welcome everybody. This is the Salt Talk with Jermine Alberty, and I'm so excited to launch season 2 with my friend, Dr. Jessica Young Brown, the author of the book, Making Space at the Well, Mental Health and the Church. First of all, I was honored to provide a endorsement of this book, actually. So I'm on the back cover. I provided an endorsement of the book, and we did a conference together. It was almost 2 years ago in Indiana. And so hooking back up because we really want to talk about a very crucial topic, the intersection of faith, mental health, and community support. Dr. Brown begins her book with this biblical motif of going to the village well or the waters that sustain life and exploring the communal significance of that well. Now, what's great about this is not only is she a professor and clinical psychologist, but she brings a common approach to a very difficult topic. And she's calling on the Black church, but any church, really, to rally themselves to address this important topic around mental health, in particular the Black church, because of our historic resilience and our creativity that we have to just overcome stuff. I think, though, that's difficulty. It's that sometimes we are so resilient and so creative that we really don't acknowledge and engage people in our pews who are struggling with mental health concerns. And so why are we having this discussion? Because July is National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month, also known as BIPOC Mental Health Month. And during this month, our goal is to raise awareness of the unique mental health challenges faced by racial and ethnic minority communities in the United States. Now, what is this podcast going to include? I love acronyms, and I guess Dr. Brown does too, because she created this acronym called SPACE, and we're going to discuss this acronym called SPACE. This episode explores the journey of silencing the stigma around mental illness, and then we're going to discuss the presence and persistence that's needed in our relationships to heal both mind and spirit, and share some practical steps for application and action. You hear it already? SPA, the application and action in our everyday lives. And then we're going to touch on some cautions related to mental health crises and the vital role of referrals. And then finally, we're going to draw on the power of testimony and expression and exhortation to encourage our entire faith communities to embrace the healing power of God. And doing these things, we make space at the well. So let's embark on this journey together where faith meets mental wellness and communities stand strong. This is Jermine Alberty, and welcome to the Salt Talk. Well, we're back with my friend, Dr. Jessica Young Brown, and we're going to talk about that acronym we talked about earlier in our intro, and we're going to jump into that S, silencing the stigma. What we know is that mental health carries a lot of stigma, especially in the African-American community. So my first question, Dr. Brown, is what are some common misconceptions or negative attitudes that you've encountered, and how can we start addressing these within our communities?
Sure. So I'll try to keep this brief because, you and I know we've been doing this work for a long time, so I could, talk forever just about this first question. If I think about some of the most common points of stigma I've seen, a primary one that we often see in faith communities, and I'm sure you've encountered this, is that mental health symptoms are an indication of spiritual failing, right? Yes. So people will say things like, well, you just need to be praying more, you need to get in your word, or you need to have faith, right? And the message that sends, either accidentally or on purpose, is those symptoms are your fault, right?
Yeah.
Which is really, really damaging when, we know all of the risk factors that go into mental health symptoms developing. And many of those are totally outside of our control. It's biology, it's environmental, it's situational, right? Now, we do have a sense, we want to build a sense of control in terms of how we respond to those symptoms. But for many of us, it's not like we woke up one day and decided, oh, I think I'm going to be anxious today. Or, Thursday seems like a good day to be depressed. No, these are things that are outside of our control, and we need help to try to figure out how to manage them. And so when we accidentally tell people this is your fault and you need to just pray enough, it can be really damaging. Not to mention, there are very faithful people who are engaging in all of the spiritual disciplines and still have mental health symptoms. You can flip open your Bible to any page and find a prophet or some other beloved of God having mental health symptoms, right? So it's everywhere.
It
An-
is. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Another big one that I think we're continuing to tackle is this idea that mental health symptoms or mental illness are synonymous with people who are dangerous or unable to control themselves or somehow a threat, right? And so really that is fueled by news media and popular media, which provide these caricatures of mental illness. And it is a way to other people. When the reality is, we know all the statistics suggest that about 1 in 5 American adults, right, meet criteria for a diagnostic condition. And we both know that's an underestimate. That's an underestimate. So folks with mental health conditions are not people out there over there. They are us. They are in our families. They are people who go to work every day and raise their kids. And we are just trying to live our lives, right? And because most mental health symptoms can be invisible, something that we don't always see, it gives us this false sense that it's not as common as it really is, when the reality is that many people are coping with those symptoms on a daily basis.
Yeah, when I think of the word stigma, I think about this whole ideal of shame and blame.
Yes.
We're blaming people for their illness and saying somehow that there's some kind of shortcoming of why they themselves are dealing with that particular illness. And the other thing that we need to do is treat mental health challenges just like any other illness. And
Yes.
I think that dealing with that, you mentioned the perception from the media, that bleeds into why people believe what they believe about it. And you mentioned violence. And I share people that 96% of violence in society has no attribution to mental illness, only 4%.
Yes.
And so when you begin to have that, then you begin to hopefully have folks who are living with different mental health challenges become more welcome in our churches and not be seen as disruptive and as people who, are going to cause trouble within the faith community, so forth. So silencing the stigma is really important. That's our first part of the acronym. S, we want to silence the stigma. And so can you share a personal story or example where you've seen the impact of stigma on someone's mental health journey from a clinical perspective?
Sure. Yeah. I don't know if you've actually heard me share this story, but the reason I'm a clinical psychologist is because my father dealt with major depression. And my father was a pastor and sort of the consummate pastor. He was someone who was very clearly called to be a pastor and felt real passion around it. And he experienced major depression as a result of burnout. And he was someone who was very highly educated. His best friend was a psychologist. And so he got treatment, but my family never, ever talked about it. He got so depressed that he actually had to take a few months away from church to get treatment and kind of regroup. And nobody in the congregation knew, even as his daughter. I didn't know. I realized my father had depression when I was sitting in my Psych 101 class in college, and they were describing the symptoms of major depression. And I thought, oh, that's my dad, right? And so this is, again, both of my parents, very highly educated. My father was best friends with a psychologist. He had the language.
Hmm.
He knew what was happening. but he
Mm.
didn't know how to be somebody's pastor and
Mm.
also be somebody who had depression. We just didn't have the language, right?
And I love that because what you just told people is that mental illness does not discriminate.
At all.
It doesn't
At
matter what your
all.
position is, your title is, no matter your education, no matter, don't discriminate. Anybody can be impacted. And the fact that he had to get treatment in silence and not even his own
Yes.
family could know about that.
Yes.
I mean, it just speaks to the stigma that's associated there. And so we have to silence the stigma, but we have to also scream loud, and be like, listen, it's okay. It's okay to get
Absolutely.
help. It's okay.
Absolutely.
You know,
And stigma has I'm
oh,
sorry,
go
go
ahead. No,
ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say stigma has a ripple effect because as therapists, one of the questions we ask people is, has anybody in your family ever experienced mental health conditions, right? That's one of the ways we try to assess for a possible biological component to people's symptoms. But in my case, if someone had asked me that before I figured it out, I would have said no. When in
Mm-hmm.
actuality, what I know about my family is we do have a history of major depression and not just my dad, right? But it was only this is the way generational healing and generational trauma works. Out of my 9 cousins on my father's side, 3 of us are mental health professionals, right? So on some level, we knew, okay, we got to get this because our family doesn't know how to talk about this. And while
To,
all of us,
tonight's word is wow. I keep saying wow,
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 because
right?
it's like, it's mind blowing,
33%
right?
of us.
My goodness.
But what we all realized, to speak to the stigma piece, while we were in graduate school, sort of independently, is that we had other members of our family who dealt with mental health conditions too.
Mm.
And our family is expert at keeping secrets, right? Expert at not talking about it. And so many of us in Black families can relate to this idea of we found out something by accident. And now we're trying to sort of cope with the consequences of that. We don't want that to continue to be our legacy as Black folks. We
Yeah.
can't get free if we can't talk about it. And so we have to work to combat stigma on a regular basis.
So what I hear you saying is, how do we break these generational patterns?
Yes.
Because it's not a curse, it's a pattern that occurs across generations, and it's only not broken because it's not talked about.
Absolutely.
A colleague of mine, Dr. Amanda Calhoun, and I did a podcast together recently. Dr. Amanda is over at Yale and talked about genograms.
Yeah.
And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we could do a genogram of both our medical and mental health histories? And how many of us could really honestly be able to look at, we could look at maybe divorce and look at different, maybe alcoholism, if you would, or other mental, but mental illnesses like depression and anxiety are often overlooked. And
Right.
could we accurately complete a genogram with our mental health history from a family? Well, we probably could medical, maybe, but we probably couldn't with the mental health history simply because we don't talk about it.
Right.
I think this
Right.
really flows into your P part of the acronym, presence and persistence, because what we need truly for healing is authentic relationships. They
Yes.
are so crucial in the healing process. So my question to you is, how can we foster deeper, more genuine connections that support mental wellness?
Yeah, I love this question. I joke with people whenever I'm talking about the book that like this section is the rocket science section because what I'm telling people to do is like sit down and listen,
Mm-hmm.
right? Be in one place at one time. And that doesn't sound groundbreaking, but if we think about how we tend to move through the world, it actually is revolutionary to just be focused on one thing at a time and
Mm-hmm.
be focused on being present with another person, right? To actually sit down and ask someone how they're doing and wait for a response and then engage with that response, right? It's more than a lot of us do in our daily interactions. And the other piece that is, I'm not saying that all churches do this, but I'm saying that it's something that we have to contend with often in churches, is that sometimes relationships in churches can feel transactional, right? Like, oh, I'm going to check in with you when I need you to stuff some envelopes for me, or when I need you to fill in at children's church, or whatever the case may be, right? And that feels different than me saying, hey, I just want to get to know who you are as a person. Tell me your story. Tell me about what you're interested in. Tell me about how we can connect, right? And that matters because when we're in a position, let's say we've experienced something traumatic, or we're in a position where we are having symptoms, but we are maybe feeling shame about those symptoms, right? One of the ways we protect ourselves is to really be on guard about who we can trust, right? And so as members of faith communities, we have to make ourselves trustworthy in order for people to be able to take their guard down and even tell us what's going on with them. And even more importantly, to be able to notice when people's behaviors change. Because one of the things we know happens when people begin experiencing mental health symptoms, especially if they're on the more severe end, is people's behaviors might change, right? And so if we're able to identify, wait a minute, this person usually engages in this way, but they're seeming really different. If I have a relationship with you, I can say, hey, Jermaine, I noticed, you kind of seem different in these ways, and I just want to check in to see if you're okay, right? But I can only do that if I've taken the time to build a relationship with you ahead of time so that I can come to you from an authentic place.
And you mentioned one really important word, and that word was transactional. Because so many times it is transactional and it's not authentically relational. Like, do I even really know your favorite color? Do I even know? Like, what do I really know about you other than, hey, Sister Brown, how you doing? That's it.
Exactly.
That's it. And so really knowing those who are laboring amongst us and being present, that right there is so very important. And I really think that it really segues nicely to my next question, which is, in your experience, what role do you believe that persistence plays in maintaining these supportive relationships? And the key word there is persistence, right? It's just like, because we're so transactional, right? It's like, when I need you, I'll ask. So how would the persistence play a supportive, a really supportive, strong role, especially when someone is struggling with a mental health challenge?
Yeah, I'll give you an example from my own life. So I went through a period, we all have seasons in life when it seems like everything is happening all at once, right? And so I went through a period like that, and I wasn't at church for several months, which is unusual for me. And my pastor sent me a text and he said, hey, you don't have to respond unless you want to. I just want you to know that we miss you and we love you. And I responded, I said, hey, I'm okay. Thanks. And that's all I said. A couple weeks later, he said, hey, you don't have to respond unless you want to. I'm just checking in. I want you to know I'm praying for you. Right? Never once. I was out maybe 4 or 5 months. I don't know exactly how long. He kept in touch with me. Never once did he ask me when I was coming back to church. Not one time. This is my pastor. I was serving in ministries. Like my absence was impacting other people, right? I know it was. And it was clear to me from the way my pastor engaged and the way other people checked on me that they weren't checking on me because I wasn't filling a role. They were checking on me because they cared about me, right? And so after a period of time, I could say, okay, here's what's been going on. I'm ready to come back. Like I was able to kind of reintegrate. But part of that was because they made it clear to me that like it's not like I lost my space because I wasn't doing my job anymore. You know what I mean? And so I think there's a way in which sometimes people just need to know, like, we care about you by virtue of the fact that you are a human being and you're connected to us. And because those things are true, we want you to be okay whether or not you ever step foot in this physical community again. We want you to be okay just because we love you, right? Oh, we can only send that message if we really mean it, right? Because otherwise, people will be able to tell that it's a show. They will. But it matters so much, especially, we talk about the fact that sometimes people feel like when things are going haywire, they need to move away. And folks within churches will say, well, that's the time when you need to be pressing in. And, right? People don't always feel like they can do that for a variety of reasons. But if I know that this community is praying for me, regardless of whether they've seen me recently, that's a powerful motivator. And it's a tether to allow me to come back to community when I'm ready to do that. And so that's what I mean when I say persistence. Now, the caveat I'll put here is if somebody sets a boundary with you and says, leave me alone, we respect boundaries and we leave people alone. That's the caveat I'll put.
But I like the fact that you said you don't have to respond. You don't have to respond, just checking in. And many times I'll leave messages like that all the time with friends. I'm like, listen, I'm just calling, just checking in. No need to respond, just checking in. And I think those calls are some of the most appreciated because it's just, listen, I just want you to know I'm thinking of you. Yes. And I think that right there, that persistence of saying, I'm feeling you, I'm feeling you, I'm missing you. Right. I think that's so important. And when people are dealing with mental health challenges, they often can lose hope that anyone cares about them. And so when you make that effort to say, hey, I'm concerned, we care about you. And like you said, we don't care if you ever step back into the place. Just know that we're concerned about you.
Right. That's the key. No strings attached.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And if you think about people who are grieving, all of the contact you get if you've lost a family member, it's overwhelming, right? Yeah. But just to have people who say, hey, I just want you to know I'm praying for you or I'm thinking about you, right, can go a long way. And it really can be a lifeline for people. We don't ever want people walking around in this world feeling like they're all alone. And that call or text could very well be a lifeline for somebody.
You're really speaking to the Surgeon General put out, the notice saying, listen, there's an epidemic of loneliness and isolation, and it needs to be addressed. And it's not just loneliness within the senior population, but in general. And folks think with all the social media we have and all the ways we have to connect with each other, how could you be lonely? In many ways, I believe social media gives the perception when I check in that I'm good, but I'm really only putting out there what I want you to know is going on with me. Right. And so I really think that what you really tap into is your A part of the acronym, which is application and action. So when it comes to addressing mental health needs, what are some practical steps? We've talked about some already, but what are some practical steps individuals in faith communities can take to provide better support? You said just checking in. That could be one action we can take. What else could we do possibly?
Sure. I think we need to educate, right? And that spans the gamut from a bulletin board to a Bible study to a sermon, right? We need to talk about mental health. When I'm talking to pastors all the time, I say, you don't have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to find a scripture to preach about mental health. It's everywhere in the Bible. And what I encourage people to do is to attend to how God responds to people who are suffering in the Bible. All of this foolishness we as human beings say is there's nothing biblical about it. There's nothing biblical about how we respond to mental health conditions when we're telling people, well, if you're going to pray, don't worry. But, like all of these things that we say, that's not in the Bible. God consistently attends to people when they are fearful, when they are angry, when they are experiencing sorrow. And the general theme is, I know, and I'm right here with you, right? Like you're not alone. So I think we have all of these opportunities to talk about mental health in the context of the church. That can happen with the folks who are already in the church, or you can have a mental health professional come in and do a workshop or a talk. This book is the product of a Bible study that I did at my home church when I was in graduate school. You said I liked acronyms. I had to take a community psychology class when I was in graduate school, and my professor told us to develop a community-based intervention, and the best community-based interventions have acronyms. So that's why this book is an acronym. I went to my pastor at the time and I said, hey, can I do a workshop at the church? And she said, how about 6 weeks of Bible study? Right? And so we spent 6 weeks in our regular Bible study time talking about mental health and coping with mental health symptoms. Right? So every single church, it's not about developing some big mental health ministry, though some churches might have that, but every single church can do something to talk about, to educate, to keep the conversation going. The next thing we can all do is develop a resource list. Don't wait until somebody comes to you with an issue. You can start developing the resource list now. When you've done the relationship building work that we talked about a minute ago, then you know who the folk in your congregation are and the types of needs they might have. You know if you have folks with food insecurity, with housing insecurity, who might need help with accessing social services benefits, who might need tutoring. Maybe you are near a military base, and so you have a lot of folks who've served in the military who might need support. Maybe you have a population of folks who's dealt with addiction, right? When you know who your people are, you can develop a resource list that is ready-made. So when people come to you and articulate a need, you're able to respond quickly. And we're not just talking about mental health services. As I said, we're talking about all different types of services, because issues like housing insecurity and food insecurity, financial insecurity are mental health concerns. When people are dealing with poverty, when people are dealing with joblessness, they're at higher risk for those mental health conditions. So when we support the whole person, that's actually a mental health intervention in addition to being a lifestyle intervention.
I love that. And I think one of the things that if we can, as a church, community, faith community, do the preventative work through education.
Yes.
And then be able to get trained in different programs where we can then recognize signs and symptoms early and do early intervention, then that makes the treatment part that you do a little easier, because the sooner we get help, the better the outcome. So
absolutely.
I really think, one of the questions I was going to ask you, but you've already answered, was some of those specific actions that congregations and faith groups can take to implement mental health proactively. You just answered some of those questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the thing about it is education, it is resource lists, but I think it is not just waiting for this month of July to be active about it, but all year long. Like, it shouldn't just be like July is National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. September is Self-Prevention Month. October is, no, just like build it into the life of the ministry.
Yes.
Talk about mental health and talk about addiction challenges in a way that folks feel open enough to have those discussions. I have suggested that even when we have altar calls, even when we have time for prayer, that we're not just praying for those people with cancer, but those with depression, and those who live with anxiety disorders, and those who live with psychotic disorders. And let's pray for those who live, and literally out loud.
Yes.
With dementia, those with Alzheimer's. I mean, just out loud, calling forth the illness and saying, we pray, we walk with. To me, that would be healing. That would say, they're recognizing what I'm living with. And I may be more willing to talk about it when I hear my illness on the list.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Wouldn't that
And
be
I think,
amazing? I'm like, I just thought about a bulletin like depression, Jermaine Alberty. That would be so powerful because we have the cancer list. But not let's
mhm,
wait for that brother Jermaine. He's dealing with depression.
yes, yes.
Goodness.
Because that's a part of what we need to do is really normalize this kind of suffering, right? Because it happens so often and we don't want people to experience it, but they are. So we can't pretend like it's not happening, right? Having a mental health first aid training at your church and making it available to the whole congregation, right? Even for instance, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, you can go on SAMHSA's website and order 100 brochures of almost anything, have that out in the outside of the sanctuary, the same place you have the flyers for summer camp, right? Those kinds of things are very low impact, but like you said, you're infusing it into the conversation and the life of the church.
Yeah.
And that's really what will help people to get free. Because if I know it's something that we talk about in my church all the time, the level of shame I feel saying, I have actually been really anxious the past couple of weeks and I think I need some help lowers, right? And
Yeah.
then I'm actually able to get my needs met.
I mean, even inviting groups to come in and sponsor support groups at our church, some
Absolutely.
churches, will sponsor Celebrate Recovery or a 12-step program. But what about an anxiety disorder support group or a depression, bipolar, a support group? Why not literally say we are going to have support groups for those in our congregations who are living with these mental health challenges as well as addiction challenges?
Mm-hmm.
What we do know, though, is many times the greatest fear for many churches is liability. What happens if a crisis happens and are we going to be sued or are we going to be liable? Mental health crises can be daunting for churches and how to respond. There's certain risks that are carried along with those things. And so, what are some of the fears or risks people might face and how can they be mitigated when we talk about crisis situations like suicide or self-injury or things of that nature?
Sure. I think, there's fair concern that people have from a liability perspective. Most of those concerns can be resolved by getting really clear on staying in our lane. The litmus test that I like to offer clergy is if you feel like you're in over your head, you are, right? A lot of times, clergy and churches in general are really a first line of defense. We need leaders, though, who are able to discern when does this reach a point where I need to get this person to a mental health professional and I stick to a pastoral care role. So as leaders, we need to be having those conversations often and regularly and give people some clear touch points in terms of when we're going to refer to a mental health professional. That means we need to have some mental health professionals to refer to, right? So you've got to develop your list ahead of time. And we also need to know not just when to refer, but how to refer. So how can we have a conversation with people where we can say, hey, I really think this is most appropriate for a mental health provider. Can I walk with you through this process? So that's the first piece. We need to get clear on what is ours to do and what is not ours to do and communicate that with the congregation. Related is this awareness that clergy and Christian educators are mandated reporters. And so at the state level, there are some things that we have to share. If there's an abuse or neglect situation, we have a legal responsibility. That's not just mental health professionals and teachers. It's religious leaders too, who have that responsibility. And so it's important to just understand what those laws are in your state and how those function. When I was working in youth ministry, I would tell my kids on the front end, listen, I'm a confidential person. You can come to me and I'm not going to tell anybody, but I will break your trust to save your life. So
Mm-hmm.
here are the guidelines under which I will break your trust, right?
Yes.
And And that's a conversation that we had to have because I was never willing to put one of my kids in danger in order to keep their secrets, right? So that's where we can get into trouble with liability issues. The other big concern that people have, and we talked about this a little earlier, is around safety issues. And so what I would offer is that as church leaders, even if you have a mental health professional who's a member of your church, unless they're in a professional capacity with your church, they really should not be doing any of that deep level assessment if you have someone who's considering self-injury or psychotic or anything like that. That's not their role in your congregation, right? So your congregation needs to focus on pastoral care and getting people connected with the resources as quickly as possible. What I encourage people to do in the context of their church is to have a plan in place. So if someone comes to someone on the leadership team and says they're experiencing psychosis or they're experiencing suicidal ideation, what's our plan for how we would manage that? What are the phone calls we're going to make, right? Have all of that outlined ahead of time so that if something like that comes, you're not scrambling trying to figure out what will happen. This is a little dependent upon the state, but community service boards or community-based mental health organizations are a great entry point if you're not sure what else to do or who else to call. And we now, of course, have the nationwide 988 hotline. That's a great resource and a starting point. So if you're not sure, sit that person down and say, hey, let's call 988 and we're going to figure this out, right? And what that means for us in faith communities is when we have to make a referral, we always maintain the pastoral care position. A referral is never throwing someone away or absolving us of our responsibility. It's a warm handoff and we continue to provide support. Sometimes that looks like actually making a call with the person to the therapist. Sometimes that looks like driving them to the hospital so they can do a voluntary admission. Sometimes that looks like sitting with them while we call emergency services to get them evaluated, right? So we're always going to do what we do best, which is pastoral care, but we want to make sure that when people get to the point where they need professional mental health services, we're not delaying that in our effort to provide care.
I think that what you've just laid out is really saying to those in faith communities, whether they be clergy, whether they be lay leaders, whether they be members, is that there are certain boundaries and limitations, and we need to know when to refer.
Yes.
It's beyond our ability. And you've even said that even if I'm a professional, there's ethical boundaries that I need to consider, even when supporting a faith community, unless that's specifically my role in that sense.
Absolutely.
I think that so many times we, in our effort to do good, we often do harm. And we have to know our limits and know our boundaries. And so we have covered a lot of good stuff. Okay, let's begin at the top. Silencing the We talked about presence and persistence and application and action. Just talked about some cautions, and we're going to wrap up this podcast interview with expression and exhortation. What we know is testimony service is very powerful in the Black church. We know that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right? So the question I have is, how can sharing our mental health journeys encourage others to seek help and healing? You've shared your journey on this, with your father. To me, I think that's amazing to be like, that's what inspired me to do this work.
Absolutely.
That testimony there, how can those testimonies really encourage other folks?
Yeah, I think there's something so powerful about realizing, one, that what you're experiencing is a thing that people experience. You're not the only one, right? That's why we have support groups, because there's something really powerful about knowing, okay, other people have felt anxious. Other people have trouble sleeping. Other people have intrusive thoughts. But, one of the big one of the most powerful components, right, of testimony service in particular, if we think about that rich Black church tradition, is this sense that we can see people who have arrived where we want to go, right? And so this testimony of, I was depressed, I was anxious, I was dealing with the symptoms of PTSD, and here's how God brought me through it, right? Whether that's therapy, whether that's medication, whatever the case may be. Just as you mentioned this earlier, just as we hear stories of cancer survivors or people who celebrate their cholesterol being lower or people who celebrate their heart function increasing, right? We want to be able to celebrate with folks around mental health conditions that same way. One of the things I do whenever I'm doing a workshop, it could be, a conversation with 5 people or an auditorium with 500, I mentioned that I have a therapist. It's not because I just really like telling people I have a therapist, but it's because I know if people see Dr. Brown has a therapist, that might make it a little more accessible for them, right? And unless I decided to share with you about mental health symptoms that I've experienced, you wouldn't necessarily assume that about me, right? So I'm also letting people know, hey, even if people don't always see it, even if people don't recognize that you're suffering, it's actually okay to name that you need help. And in fact, God desires that you do what you need to do to be made well, right? I love John 10:10. It's one of my favorite scriptures. And it's the one that's really familiar to people, right? The enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I've come that they might have life and have it more abundantly. The New Living Translation says, my purpose is that they would have a rich and satisfying life. And so I think the call for all of us is to think about, what is this rich and satisfying life God is calling me to? And from my perspective, that means mental health and mental wholeness. It means no longer pretending that we're okay when we're not okay. It means seeking out help, and you can seek out spirit-led help, right? Pray and ask God to guide you to the right therapist and the right psychiatrist and the right coach, right? Because what we want to be able to do is to have that testimony period where we can say, I was in a deep place of depression, but me and God worked this thing out, right? And now I'm on the other side of it. I'm using my tools. I've gotten the treatment I've needed. I was able to use my spiritual disciplines as a resource. And now I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. We want everybody to be able to have that experience. The beauty of testimony service is that it's an invitation to everybody to come and get well, right? And that's what we want to do as faith communities.
I know everybody that listens to this podcast may not be a Christian or not, and that's fine. But I want to just read a passage from the book because I think it speaks to any faith leader. If Jesus had permission to cry, then surely we do too. You're right. Our salvation has never, ever required us to deny our humanness. Powerful quote. If Jesus can cry, we can cry. If Jesus can be human, we too should exhibit that humanity also. And so I just really think that so many times, as people of faith, we think somehow that our spirituality should supersede our humanity.
Yes.
Reality is no. They go hand in hand. And so I want to read one more passage from the book, and it talks about the well. Mm-hmm. It says about Martha and Mary when they lost Lazarus.
Yeah.
Say, I can only imagine the relief Mary and Martha must have felt as he wept, to know that they were not alone in their grief. I can also imagine that having seen Jesus cry in that moment, they experienced Lazarus' eventual resurrection as that much more miraculous. And this is what space at the well looks like. Digging the well means we have a profound awareness that as a church, we must present a balm for people facing struggles out there in the world. To draw from the well, we must be like Jesus. If Jesus cried, if Jesus mourned, if Jesus grieved, so can we.
So can we.
We have to make space at the well for everybody. For everybody. Well, listen, friends, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Soft Talk with Jermine Alberty. Dr. Brown, thank you so much, my friend, for being my first guest in season 2.
Thank you. I'm excited and honored. It's been a pleasure.
What a way to reunite. We're going to have to stay connected for sure. Listen,
yeah,
y'all, we have unpacked some critical issues around the mental health in our community and explore how we can silence the stigma, build authentic relationships, and take practical steps toward healing. Remember, addressing mental health is not just an individual journey, but a collective mission of faith and support. So as we wrap up, I encourage you to reflect on today's discussion and think about how you can apply these insights in your own life and community. Let's continue to embrace the power of our testimonies and support one another in accessing the healing power of God. Until next time, I want you to stay strong, stay hopeful, and keep the conversation going. I'm Jermine Alberty, and this is another episode of the Soft Talk with Jermine Alberty.